Welcome to part 2. Now, the main video I wanted to cover on was a debate with the most recent debate that Mosab and Cenk had together on the Piers Morgan show. But I thought before I get to covering that, I thought I should cover an earlier interaction they'd had on the Open to Debate podcast. I thought it was worth looking at this because this is it gives a bit of a context as to why the debate on Piers Morgan show was as vitriolic as it was. It was, it was not at all civilized as a debate. And here you kind of see this is where things start on us. This is the debate in which things started to escalate between him and Cenk, and I think it kind of gives some context as to why the Piers Morgan debate was so hostile. It's like there's two people in the room who could clearly barely tolerate each other.
The minute they moved those settlers into Gaza, you'll know for sure that this had nothing to do with self-defense. All of it was an excuse to steal more Arab land.
People like Cenk, they are living in a conspiracy theory, alternative reality. Palestinian is not limited to Gaza. Palestinian is a syndrome. It's a mental illness. And Cenk is the perfect example.
Okay, so you would like me to respond to a guy who just escaped from a mental asylum?
You are a parasite, a bottom feeder. This is the problem that we have dealing with scumbags like this.
But enough beating around the bush, let's get into it.
This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. Hi, everybody. For an episode that attempts to explore what may be possible or impossible in the quest for that elusive result known as peace in the Middle East, a phrase that especially now seems to be the very definition of hopelessness. We have Israel seeking to destroy Hamas. We have Hamas seeking to destroy Israel. And where does it go from there? If it is not going to end in an endless and escalating war where one side utterly destroys the other, how does resolution come about? It would have to involve both sides at some point deciding to stop, deciding to negotiate, deciding to compromise. And how realistic a scenario is that? In this debate, that is the question we are going to explore. And we are phrasing it around this particular question: can Israel make peace with Hamas?
As I said in my video on a case for whataboutism, I think I've come to the realization that I don't defend Israel with any great zealotry, but I do know to a degree that whatever its catalogue of sins over the years, one thing that really sticks in my craw is, and that's been exposed by by October the 7th and everything since, is just how unbelievably vindictive and petty and rotten the UN is, and how particularly Israel's neighbours are.
It's been over a year, and the UN is not lifted a finger to free the hostages. I stand here to echo the cries of the 101 hostages who have now been in hell for over a year. Look at me. I am proof they can still be saved. In this moment, 60 meters underground with no air, no light, no hope, my friends are still being held by monsters. My heart is still with them, captive in Gaza. I stand here and demand that you bring them all home now. Just be human.
You realise that their vindictive pettiness, their grudge against Israel is what has basically cursed the region. It's cursed generations of Palestinians and Israelis to needless killing of one another.
It's to say that the Arab world has failed the Palestinian people is like saying the Nazis failed the Jews in the Second World War. But what the Arabs have done, what the Arab countries collectively have done, and what the Palestinian leadership have done, is far worse than failure. It is betrayal. It's betrayal, it's abuse, it's using them as cannon fodder. It's turning them from being decent, ordinary human beings, wanting to prosper, wanting to have freedom, wanting to live in peace in their territory, into being simply weapons of war in a century-long war between the Arab world and the Jewish national homeland. To illustrate that, I want to just read from a couple of quotes from the horse's mouth. And the first one, this is from Emil Ghouri, the secretary of the Arab Higher Committee, who said, "I do not want to impugn anyone, but only to help the refugees. The fact that there are these refugees is the direct consequences of the action of the Arab states in opposing partition and the Jewish state. The Arab states agreed upon this policy unanimously, and they must share in the solution of the problem." Ralph Galloway, the former director of UNRWA, said the Arab states do not want to solve the refugee problem. They want to keep it as an open sore, as an affront to the United Nations, and as a weapon against Israel. Arab leaders don't give a damn whether the refugees live or die.
And it's sickening, really. It's sickening to see it in such a stark and petty light. You know, just brazenly petty, the brazen pettiness of the Arab world and the UN, particularly the Arab League and the UN.
Hamas is committing a crime against this generation and the next generations to come. So blaming Israel is not going to solve the problem.
The real tragedy is that Israel was close to peace. It was close to a normalization peace deal with Saudi Arabia, and it's Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen who decided to act against that, to sabotage that deal and commit the horrific attack they did just to force this war to come about. You know, normalization deal that would have benefited the region, possibly would have even benefited the Palestinians to a degree. It would have enriched the region.
It would have to involve both sides at some point deciding to stop, deciding to negotiate, deciding to compromise. And how realistic a scenario is that? In this debate, that is the question we are going to explore. And we are phrasing it around this particular question: can Israel make peace with Hamas? Let's meet our debaters. I first want to welcome Cenk Uygur. Cenk is the host, founder, and CEO of The Young Turks, which is one of the largest online news shows in the world. You were previously, Cenk, you were the host of MSNBC Live. You've also appeared as a commentator on CNN, ABC, NPR, Al Jazeera, and Fox. You've been a vocal advocate for ceasefire since early in the war. You're going to be answering yes, that Israel can make peace with Hamas. Thanks so much for joining us on Open to Debate.
Thank you.
And I want to welcome on the other side, answering no to that question, Mosab Hassan Yousef. Mosab, you are the son of a Hamas co-founder. You grew up surrounded by the forces and the politics of Hamas before you started working with Israeli intelligence to help bring the organization down. Mosab, you are also the author of the New York Times bestseller, Son of Hamas, as well as the newly published memoir, From Hamas to America. Thanks so much for joining us on Open to Debate.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's get to our opening statements and what we have in answer to our question, can Israel make peace with Hamas, is one debater answering yes and the other answering no. Cenk, you're up first. Your answer is yes. Here's your chance, please, to tell us why.
Yep. So can Israel make peace with Hamas? Of course. That's who you make peace with, your enemies, not your allies. This is actually pretty elementary. No matter how bad the enemy is, at some point, if you want to get to peace, and that's a big if, then you're going to have to do it with your enemies and not allies. So if Israel wants to do a peace deal with Norway, that's not really going to help them. They can get there pretty quickly, but that's not the issue at hand. They're fighting Hamas. That's who they have to negotiate with, and that's who they have to get to an agreement with.
That's kind of baseless, I have to say. The idea that you can because you must, and because you can. It's a bit circular, a bit baseless, frankly. And it kind of overlooks the situations which you can't make peace with certain enemies of a particular ideological bent, such as the Nazis. You know, Britain could not make peace with the Nazis, and Israel has never made peace with Hamas. Every supposed treaty that Israel has negotiated has just been a delaying tactic that's, whilst Hamas has remained ideologically committed to the destruction of Israel, the hatred of Israel. There's no trustworthy peace partner. But let's carry on. Let's hear out his case.
To negotiate with, and that's who they have to get to an agreement with. And sometimes when you reject out of hand any discussions at all, under the rubric of we don't talk to evil, it turns into a disaster. Why? We know it already happened. Dick Cheney said that after 9/11 and our invasion of Iraq.
There was no negotiation option with Al-Qaeda. As Christopher Hitchens detailed, you cannot negotiate with a terrorist group that lists as one of its grievances that you prevented a genocide in East Timor by the Muslim dictators there.
A genocide more comprehensive than Cambodia, taking place a little afterwards, with our weapons, with our diplomatic protection, and with the endorsement of Kissinger and Ford. Hands up those who roughly remember this. Okay, not as good as I'd have liked, but still, and sad, but bear it in mind and look it up. Now, what are some of the items of the Al-Qaeda bin Laden manifesto? Well, oddly enough, and this was to my surprise, I thought it would be lower down. Item 3 in the charge against the West is that it reversed course on East Timor, tried to undo the genocide, brought East Timor to a referendum on independence, sent Jose Vieira de Mello, one of the greatest, Sergio Vieira de Mello, one of the greatest UN civil servants, to East Timor to supervise the transition to independence and the election, and made East Timor the newest member of the UN. Bin Laden says, "For this we will never forgive the Christian Crusaders and their imperialist friends. They took away a republic from a Muslim land, Indonesia." Most of the people of East Timor, by the way, are Christian and speak Portuguese. A detail. For this, we will never forgive them. For this, that was the reason they gave for blowing up the UN office in Iraq, because that's where Melio was sent next, with a truck bomb of explosives so enormous that it must have been borrowed from the former Iraqi army and Ba'ath Party. That's the reason they gave for blowing up the Australian tourists in Bali, in Indonesia, and the Indonesian taxi drivers who were servicing that resort, because they couldn't forgive the West for its behavior in East Timor. In other words, if you want to avoid upsetting these people, you have to let Indonesia commit genocide in East Timor. Otherwise, they'll be upset with you. You'll have made an enemy. If you tell them they can't throw acid in the faces of unveiled women in Karachi, they will be annoyed with you. If you say, we insist, we think that cartoonists in Copenhagen can print satire on the Prophet Muhammad, you've just made an enemy. You've brought it on. You're encouraging it to happen. So unless you're willing to commit suicide for yourself and for this culture, get used to the compromises you'll have to make and the eventual capitulation that will come to you. But bloody well don't do that in my name, because I'm not doing it. You surrender in your own name, leave me out of it. I'm going to fight these people and every other theocrat all the way. All the way.
You know, there's no negotiating with psychopaths, evil psychopaths like that, who are that petty and that warped. The only way you negotiate with them is by bombing them, by killing them. And that's what we had to do in this war on terror. But, of course, the war on terror did turn into something of a disaster, something of a drawn-out quagmire. And it was laced with so many problems. A lot of comparisons have been made to October the 7th and 9/11. The effect of a terrorist attack like 9/11 was that it did starkly show. It was, I think, to the world the first situation of a human shield situation with terrorists. It was literally a human shield situation. Yeah, the reason the terrorists were able to attack New York was partly because because Bush made the speech and he described the attacks as cowardly terrorist attacks, and there was someone on the left saying, but they weren't cowardly, they were brave, they were martyrs, they sacrificed themselves, they were the opposite of cowards. Yeah, and that was kind of my first inkling that there was something kind of rotten on the left. It's like, how can you almost take the side of these mass murdering scumbags who murdered thousands of innocent people in New York, who committed this diabolical terrorist attack on innocent people. And pondering it for a while, I wondered, well, the cowardly part, if Bush meant anything by the cowardly part of the attack, it was the fact that they used human shields. That they put that it was unwarned, it was the use of human shields, the fact that they used a plane full of passengers, which puts the Air Force of America in a difficult position. The air defenses of America in a difficult position. Because unfortunately, the only way that they could have prevented the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center itself is you would have to shoot down the planes themselves, which means you would have to kill the passengers. It was a diabolical change of state, change of scenario. It was horrible. And no one wants to do that. And so what we were confronted with on 9/11 was this disturbing death cult that wanted to maximize as much civilian death as possible. If it wasn't enough to attack the World Trade Center, of a day during business hours, they used a plane full of passengers to do it. There was a horrible kind of diabolical genius to it. They knew that the planes would be full of fuel and would explode with enough force to demolish the towers. Conspiracy theories notwithstanding, but never mind. But I think it kind of presented a problem in terms of optics, of that to the younger generation it sent a message that these terrorists represented death. They represented a death cult, an insane cult of martyrdom, of killing the maximum civilians possible out of this belief that they were going to go to the afterlife. It was this sick, depraved death cult. It was a warped death cult. And by comparison, the West stood for freedom, life, living life to the full, freedom, and compassion and empathy. And 9/11 kind of, was the event that drew out everyone's empathy and compassion. That people were thinking in terms of, existentialism now, of, the value of life. It's like, oh my God, so many could-have-beens. And, the idea that, suddenly realising how precious life is and how fragile life is. Now, the problem with waging a war on terror is the way to galvanise people would be to, frame a kind of binary opposition to the war. The US forces, of course, they have to kill the terrorists, but they have to kind of make the point of doing the very opposite of what the terrorists do, is like minimising civilian casualties, civilian collateral, whereas the terrorists maximised it. Providing aid to Afghanistan whilst, while at the same time as bombing its combatants, the Taliban and the terrorists. But the problem is that didn't entirely work. Civilian collateral became inevitable. Missiles would kind of go off course and hit a wedding, or cluster bombs would. There was a tendency of cluster bombs to be. Children would. Children in Afghanistan would come across an unexploded cluster bomb, mistake it for an aid package, and end up blowing themselves up. Or blowing that. Then there was the fact that in order to win against the Taliban, we had to forge allies with the Northern Alliance, who were a pretty rotten warlord faction themselves. So we were not working with noble characters here. So the idea of respect for life, and us representing a love of life, a respect for life, a preservation of life, which is why we were fighting the war, to preserve American life and freedom from a death cult. I mean, to a degree, when the idea that we're going to have to bomb Afghanistan, it almost seemed to be, again, looked like a human shield. It almost framed the war itself as a human shield situation of, like the passengers on a plane, when we invade Afghanistan, our goal is to, overthrow the tyrants. But in order to do that, we risk killing the hostages, which is the civilian population who are under the grip of their terror. But the longer the war went on, the more it seemed like it was becoming impossible to maintain that binary opposition because of the amount of civilian collateral. Then when we went to war in Iraq, the civilian collateral of that skyrocketed in a war that seemed to have nothing to do with 9/11. And so the idea of this being a kind of a war of binary oppositions, and us, being the good guys trying to preserve life where we can, and versus the terrorists who wanted to kill the maximum, it became unsustainable. And worse, the Iraq war seemed to turn, the American invasion soon began to serve the effect of Al-Qaeda. The destabilization suited Al-Qaeda's purposes, and as it happens, ISIS's purposes later. So that was one of the various problems with the war. Afghanistan became a quagmire, and it was always going to. And I think what people fail to realise about the Afghanistan war is this, that this war to depose the Taliban I think it was ultimately maybe a stupid idea, because all it did was set the country back to life before the Taliban in Afghanistan, which, if you can imagine, it was actually worse than life under the Taliban. Before the Taliban took over, Afghanistan was in a state of the most horrific, endless civil war between rival warlord factions, Mujahideen factions, bombing and killing each other. It was absolute hell. And when the Taliban took over and brought some kind of stability to the country, as horrible as the Taliban were, it was a step above from the state the country was in before, believe it or not. And so by removing the Taliban, we didn't move Afghanistan forward, we actually moved it backward, back to all the factional infighting. And the more I read about the state of Afghanistan and the West's lack of understanding of the complexities of Afghanistan, the more I'm convinced that the Afghanistan mission, it didn't just fail, it was doomed to fail from the start. Now, does that mean we were wrong to wage the war on terror? Well, I don't know how you wage. I think it was necessary, absolutely necessary, to kill Al-Qaeda off, to hunt them down and kill them. You can't negotiate with Al-Qaeda, you've got to kill them. They're a killing machine. But there is a danger that it just became a quagmire, and certainly, as he says, in the end, it became necessary to strike a deal with the Taliban that allowed them to take control of Afghanistan.
Iran actually offered to completely eradicate their uranium program and wanted to get to the negotiating table with us. And they had a terrific offer, according to the reporting at the time from mainstream media news sources. And we didn't even get to find out what it was, because Dick Cheney had this insane idea that you don't negotiate with your enemies. Well, then who do you negotiate with? It's absurd. Honestly, this is one of the easiest questions of all time.
I don't know the backstory of that particularly. And of course now Biden is still trying to keep the Iranian regime appeased, but the thing is, he's suggesting a deal with Iran, and the problem is that it's exactly the Iran deal that Biden has struck with, that Obama struck with Iran, and that Biden has been continuing with Iran, that has led to October the 7th. It's all it's done is empower the regime with more money, billions of dollars with which to further oppress its people, further oppress its the feminist protest movement in Iran, and further fund Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, and given them the secure green light to the idea that they can do the October the 7th atrocities and that America won't retaliate majorly.
October 7th was not a defensive act for a two-state solution. It was an offensive against a two-state solution. Hamas doesn't want peace. Now, of course, you can say, well, Netanyahu doesn't want a two-state solution either. Okay, of course, we all know that. But it's actually completely backwards and oxymoronic to rely on the people in this story who are actually really dangerously disrupting and thwarting any prospect of peace or two-state solution as the heroes or the people that are resolving this, when they're actually just damaging this irreparably. it really is a slap in the face to see, people turning around now, making them the heroes in the story that they've been an aggressor in for the past 45 years, both domestically and regionally. There's been many diplomatic kind of negotiations with the regime. It started with Obama getting into the JCPOA with the regime, which was the nuclear deal. At that time, he unfroze $150 billion in assets, and you've got to just put that type of money into perspective. It's an obscene amount of money. Now, at that time, that was during the 2009 Green Movement, which looked really, really similar to this revolution we've been seeing, the Women Life Freedom Movement. They were at the tipping point. They were caving. Obama unleashed all of this money to them. They came back strong. The revolution died. Same thing happened. Biden not enforcing these sanctions, allowing their oil exports to reach an all-time high. Once when the people of Iran were just on the brink of taking their government out, and so it's this diplomacy that they keep doing with the mullahs that is destroying any chance the people of Iran have to free themselves from this occupying force.
The Iranian deal has made things worse. It's led to this war itself. So no, I don't buy this idea that, that it's just peace being possible.
If you say you don't want to negotiate with Hamas, all you're saying is, I don't want peace. I prefer permanent war.
Many of the victims of October the 7th in the kibbutz, in the Nova Peace Festival, they believed in peace with Gaza. They believed it was possible. And they found out the hard way that it wasn't. And that a ceasefire was just luring them into a false sense of security that Hamas would take advantage of.
One of the things that I think many people outside Israel haven't realized is that many of the kibbutz, the places where people were living, the villages and towns neighboring Gaza, were filled with left-wing peacenik types. The sort of people, for instance, who there was a woman in one kibbutz who every day she drove Palestinian children to hospitals. There were people who made sure they always had Palestinian colleagues from Gaza. They would employ them. Even the peace rave near the borders of Gaza, was significantly populated by people who sort of had the peace gig. I mean, that was their belief. That was their view, that they wanted to live in peace with their Palestinian neighbors. I think that one thing that people outside Israel really haven't understood is that it is these people who were disproportionately murdered in their homes on October the 7th.
So when you look at the idea from a different perspective and you say, well, okay, some things are so evil and terrible, and Hamas is, that you can't possibly negotiate with it. Well, under that same rubric and logic, you could certainly argue that you shouldn't negotiate with Israel. They've killed 35 times the number of civilians that Hamas did in this conflict.
That is asinine. That is so bloody asinine. Israel has to retaliate to the October the 7th atrocities massively. It has to send the message that October the 7th will not go forgiven. It has to send the message that that this will not be tolerated. When you attack a country and you attack a people that viciously, in such an evil way, then you have to send the message that this is not going to be tolerated. So Israel is sending that message. The death toll is an inevitable result of the conditions of Gaza that is so densely populated and it's ruled by Hamas terrorist lunatics who just don't care about life or death, and the fact that Egypt has closed the border as well, which is further hampering any evacuation of the Gaza, because Egypt is just that petty and rotten. So no, it's not just this is proof of how evil Israel is. This is circumstantial, but there's October the 7th did not happen because of anything other than Hamas's evil intent. Out the blue, unprovoked, on innocent civilians, thousands of innocent civilians in southern Israel.
Imagine if Hamas had killed 35 times the number of civilians Israel did. So that would be a giant number. What are we talking about? Nearly 1 million people if you took the 40,000 people that Israel has killed in Gaza and multiplied it by 35.
You know, Elan proponents actually made a brilliant point about this, which is, why have Hamas not been able to kill that many Israelis? Well, because Israel is invested in its defences. It's invested in the Iron Dome. It's made investments into the safety and security of its people. The fact that that many Palestinians have been killed in Gaza is testament to the fact that Hamas has made no provisions at all for the protection of its people. And it's decided to start an unwinnable war with Israel anyway. You know, that's the difference.
I condemn everything that has been caused by the jihadists, and this is not my opinion. This is based on causal reasoning. You kidnap people and you take them to a different place. What other option does a sovereign nation have but to return its citizens? What else? There's only two options here, right? You either release the hostages or they have to come and be rescued. So the fact that Hamas has stubbornly refused to return these hostages means that Israel has no other choice. And so what you're looking at here is Hamas persistently putting the Palestinian people in a position to be slaughtered in this way. And you know what else that's so much worse than that? When people keep coming up with these numbers, 41,000 people killed. Why? Why are 41,000 people killed? Okay. Why is it not that 41,000 people in Israel have been killed despite all of these attacks? Because Israel invests in protecting its citizens. What does Hamas do? Hamas starts a war and then hides in its terror tunnels, okay, and leaves its civilians, its children vulnerable above the ground to be exploded like cowards hiding in tunnels. So yes, I agree 41,000 is an awful number. First of all, we haven't separated the combatants, but we know that children have been killed, and the children have been killed because of Hamas. Everybody that is being killed is because of jihadists, and there is not one fact that you can make that doesn't start with the jihadists. And when the jihadists bury themselves wherever they are, whether they're in Lebanon, whether they're in Gaza, whether they're in Iran, whether they're in Syria, they are making the people of that nation, the people they are burying themselves amongst, vulnerable to being killed in this way. So yes, I absolutely condemn those deaths, and I absolutely blame the jihadists for that.
And, you know, Israel could have had the military power to completely carpet bomb the Gaza. Which they didn't. Now, if Hamas had the capability to carpet bomb Israel, October the 7th proves that that's exactly what they do. It proves that they would spare no one. Yeah, so it's like Israel does not have the intent, have the power, but not the intent. Hamas doesn't have the power, but it has the intent. And October the 7th proves that, you know, in time they'll only get the greater power to enact their intent, and their intent will only become more determined with time. Whereas Israel has kind of been sitting on its laurels thinking, well, you know, I guess we can just tolerate this enemy at our doorstep, you know, as America insists we should.
And you can say, oh my God, Israel, I can't believe how awful they are. And their civilian casualty rates are as bad as Hamas's. Hamas on October 7th was terrible. I condemn it 100%. My heart breaks for every civilian who's killed. I'm the one guy who's consistent on this. I don't want any Israelis killed. I don't want any Palestinians killed. And so, as terrible as that Hamas attack was,
I don't believe you anymore, Cenk. And I'll get to that later. I'll get to that point later why I don't, but I don't believe you.
Well, their kill ratio was 71%. They killed 815 civilians and 1,139 people overall. They killed a lot of soldiers as well. Now, none of that excuses any of their actions. But when you look at Israel's kill ratio, if you assume that every man in Palestine that they killed is a terrorist, which is an absurd, unconscionable assumption, Israel still had a civilian kill ratio of 60%.
One more thing. An absurd assumption that everyone in Gaza is a terrorist. I don't think it's so absurd. I've heard some kind of Gaza voices speak out against Hamas, but they've been very, very, very fleeting, and the overriding impression one gets is that huge numbers of the population are behind Hamas.
القنبلة حتكون كبيرة جدا، في خطر كمان عليك. لازم تطلع من البيت انت والأسرة وتبعدوا كمان نص كيلو. تمام؟ كم واحد معك؟ كم واحد معك في البيت؟
كثير. في عندك
لازم يطلعوا كلهم. كم كثير؟
يعني 20 كل الأسرة.
كم عائلة؟
3 عائلات.
تمام. يحكي مع الإخوة. أنا بستنى لحد ما تطلعوا. ما في عندنا كثير واقف. تمام يا أبو يونس.
إحنا بعاد عن البنك.
اسمعني هذا خطير. يطلعوا من البيوت ويبعدوا كمان نص كيلو. كمان الختيارية وكمان الأطفال. هذا بعيد. القنبلة حتكون كبيرة.
يا حبيبي أنا بقدرش أطلع كل الناس هذول أنا بدي أقل شيء ساعتين عبال ما كلهم يطلعوا.
يا أخوي لو ما بتطلع أنا بطوح.
أنت طخ اللي بدك إياه سويه، اللي بتنزل الأرض وتطلع.
واحد لازم يعمل كل شيء منشان ما تموت.
احنا
عندك مسؤولية على الأطفال.
بدنا نموت، كل الأطفال لازم يموتوا.
لا سمح الله بدك تستشهد
عشان تبين بشاعتكم. الله يلعنكم. اللي بترميه السما تتلقى الأرض. سووا اللي بدكم إياه. اسمع ما تقنعني. أنا ما بدي أطلع من البيت. اقصف البنك، اقصف الدار، اقصف اللي بدك إياه. سوي اللي بدك اياه.
يا ابو يونس ودك الاطفال يموتوا؟
انت خلص بدكاش الاطفال يموتوا. ما تقصف البنك حيطان. شو قاعد تقصف حيطان؟
يا ابو يونس هذا مش بايدي. بقول لك صراحه مش بايدي. انا بايدي شيء واحد. انت حتعيش بسلام.
انا بدي
انت والاولاد.
السلام اللي من عندكم ما بدنا اياه.
Now I'm going to cite an event that may sound a bit odd as in terms of, my video kind of taking this, it's like, it may sound odd to cite this given that, a lot of my videos kind of take the side of Israel, but there's a particular chapter in the Lebanon war which has been very much a dark stain on Israel, and I'll detail it here, which is of course the massacre of the refugee camps in the Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut in 1982 during the Lebanon civil war in which Israel moved in.
Middle Eastern analyst David Hurst puts blame for the massacre squarely on the shoulders of Sharon's command.
Israel had a clear and huge responsibility in the Sabra and Shatila massacre. They were the power in the land. They controlled the Phalangist militias who came in and murdered all those Palestinians in the camps. The Israelis knew what was going on. One of the architects of the massacres was seated next to Israeli officers at the Kuwaiti embassy position, overlooking the camp.
The massacre was only the dreadful climax of Sharon's activities in Lebanon. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin had planned a limited 72-hour operation against Palestinian guerrillas in South Lebanon. But his defense minister, Ariel Sharon, went all the way to Beirut.
He misled his prime minister. He went beyond the original purpose of the raid, of the invasion. From selling it originally as a limited operation up to, I think, the Litani River, he went to Beirut. And in the process, 20,000 people were killed.
The invasion ended with the evacuation of Yasser Arafat and his Palestinian fighters from Beirut, and Sharon hailed it as a victory. Within days of the PLO's evacuation, the Lebanese forces militia trained and armed by Israel entered Sabra and Shatila on their killing spree, working under the light of Israeli flares.
You should be ashamed of yourself.
I am not here to explain this horrible tragedy. It belongs to a world of dark motives, not our world. Only those who carried it out can be blamed for this massacre. I hope they will be punished.
You are an enemy of the people. You are worse than evil.
In the largest demonstration in Israel's history, 400,000 people protested Israel's role in the massacre.
The Israeli parliament the day after was incredibly volatile. Sharon was being berated by the opposition leader, who was calling him an absolute monster, saying, "You're worse than evil for what you've allowed," and he was utterly berated. And the Israeli population were horrified. There was a mass movement of peace protesters. Now bear that in mind, okay, and compare it to, were there any signs in Gaza after the October the 7th massacre of any similar outrage by the Gazan people of what happened, or the Gazan leadership? Not at all. There was none. It was all uniformly celebration, delighting in the death. You're dealing with a far more depraved population there, with far less hope that you can make any kind of peace with. There's no peace movement there. There's no movement for peace. There's no movement. There's no voices of compassion in that culture, or at least none brave enough to speak up. So how do you reform a society like that?
So when you include the innocent men, that's going to be a higher kill ratio of civilians as a percentage than Hamas. So under this logic, the Palestinians should say Israel is so evil that we cannot negotiate with them. All right, now we're at a standstill. Nobody's negotiating with anyone. This is absurd. This is not how you get to peace negotiations. And can peace negotiations work? Of course. You know who's it's worked for before? Israel, when they negotiated with Egypt. And at the time, the hardliners, just like today, said, oh, you can never trust Israel. Israel led the invasion of Israel. Egypt led the invasion of Israel twice. They were the leader of the Arab nations. They want to kill us. They're so anti-Semitic. They want to kill all the Jews. You can't negotiate with the Egyptians. They'll never follow through on any of their agreements. Well, it's been decades and decades, and they totally followed through. There was no bombing afterwards. Peace worked. It's actually very elementary. You make peace with your enemies.
As I said in my last video, I don't think the peace between Egypt and Israel is as sincere as he's made out. There's a kind of a placeholder peace, but it increasingly seems now that the placeholder peace is just, it's just that Egypt agreed not to attack Israel directly, but they're still happy to use Hamas as their allow Hamas to fester as a useful proxy to attack Israel. But anyway.
And then see if it holds. That is what has been done every single time. It's absurd to think otherwise.
Thank you, Cenk. And now, Mosab, it is your turn again. You are answering no to the question, can Israel make peace with Hamas? Your chance to tell us why, please.
Well, absolutely not. Why? Because Hamas is not a political movement. Hamas is an ideological movement that wants to destroy Israel to build an Islamic state.
Another point is worth making. I can somewhat see a case maybe that Cenk is saying that the beginnings of the peace negotiation, even if there's the ulterior motive that Egypt had to keep some measure of hostilities going, it can at least be a start. It can almost become kind of maybe a band-aid that allows the hostilities to be dropped, and maybe it can just become a de facto peace, a kind of a holding pattern of peace, if you know what I mean, that after a while just eventually becomes taken for granted as the new status quo, and an agenda to keep the war hostilities going kind of becomes forgotten or falls by the wayside, possibly. But that's not happened with Hamas at all, and I don't think it ever will. I think it's been proven that it never will, really. Yeah, I mean, like I said in my video on the Rwanda genocide, any ceasefires that were negotiated in that, much like the ceasefires that have been negotiated in the Israel-Gaza war, have been based on mutual convenience, based on appealing to the self-interest of both sides, in the understanding that you cannot keep a conflict going indefinitely without pauses in the conflict to resupply and to facilitate, goods and trade and that kind of thing. But maybe that could be the basis for at least a humanitarian pause that allows humanitarian efforts to be put into place, to at least save some lives. But that's as good as it gets, really.
And they don't stop there. Their political ambition, their religious ambition, is beyond the river and the sea. They want a global khilafah. So how can you satisfy such ambition? The situation with Egypt, with Jordan, was completely different. Israel has no problem negotiating and making peace with the Arab world. Since its establishment, Israel extended its hand to make peace with the Arab world, but the Arab world rejected. Then the foundation of the Palestinian narrative is sitting on air because, first of all, there was no such thing as Palestine. If you look at Palestine, it's only an ideology, a very violent ideology. And it took the PLO 40 years to try to destroy the state of Israel, since 1948 until the early 90s, trying to destroy the state of Israel. Then they learned the lesson that violence was a dead end. And this is when Yasser Arafat came to negotiations, and Israel had no problem negotiating with Yasser Arafat. But what happened later? We had a new generation of Palestinians, Islamists this time, not the nationalists. And that's Hamas. And now they brought us back to square number one. And even Yasser Arafat and the other Palestinian first generation told Hamas, will it take you 40 years to realize that we're going nowhere? We cannot destroy Israel? And Hamas has been trying for the past 36 years, repeating the same mistakes of the PLO and Yasser Arafat. And Israel is caught up in this situation. Tomorrow we will have the communists coming. Then after that we will have more globalists, and could be any other foreign entity using the Palestinian cause as a device to just keep trying to destroy the only Jewish state on earth. So bottom line, Israel has no problem negotiating with Arabs, making peace with Arabs. Arabs are an ethnic group, and we have no problem. There are 2 million Arabs living in Israel. They are equal citizens, and they can get along with the Jewish people. But the problem that we're having, that Israel cannot coexist with destructive ideologies such as Palestine and Hamas, because those ideologies are black holes, and nobody can satisfy their ambitions.
Thank you very much, Mosab. We're going to come up to a break, but before we do, I want to pinpoint where you each see this disagreement lying by just asking you very, very briefly in 1 or 2 sentences to tell me what you see as your opponent's weakest argument point. Cenk, why don't you go first?
Yeah, this idea that you can't negotiate with people whose ideology you don't agree with, or you might even hate. So what? I don't care about their ambitions or ideology. I care about what do they agree to in a deal. And so I if you said it that way, well, look, then I would say I'm going to eliminate the settlers. The settlers' ideology is that they own the land, God gave it to them. I think they're a bunch of lunatics, and I think that they've oppressed the Palestinians. I think their ideology is toxic, but of course I would negotiate with them.
All right,
Who else am I going to negotiate with?
Let me stop you there, and same question to you, Mosab. What did you hear from your opponent that you think is his weakest point?
Look, he's representing Hamas as a resistance movement that can be negotiated with. And I say Hamas is a Nazi ideology, worse than a Nazi ideology. And the leagues, the allies, did not negotiate with the Nazis. They killed millions of the Nazis. They destroyed Germany. And this is how we got eventually for a global peace.
Okay.
I just want to say this. The rather cheap comparison made to the settlers. I mean, yes, some settlers are pretty brutal and incredibly violent. However, there is something a bit kind of ass backward about the fact that they have become the face of everything. They become the face of the menace in the West Bank. You know, I mean, in the media that covers the Al Jazeera will do a lot of coverage of the violent nature of the settlers and the disproportionate protection they have from the IDF. But that will be covered, and it is true. But what's not covered is the areas of the West Bank that are completely, outside the control of the IDF, that are completely administered by the Palestinian Authority, where there are Palestinian neighbourhoods that, frankly, if you're not Palestinian, you do not set foot in. If you're not a Palestinian, then if you set foot in anywhere near those neighbourhoods, and there are warning signs warning you, if you enter this neighbourhood, you are going to be beheaded, literally. They will behead you. You'll be lynched. And there's even kind of a warning sign on the street before you enter. It's like, it's your last warning. So, there are areas of the West Bank where there are Palestinians there who are far more nuts, far more psychotic than the settlers are.
Just going back to what's happened in Gaza since the withdrawal. Remember, the Israelis left Gaza in 2005. It was extremely traumatic for the people of Israel because they saw members of their own army pulling forcibly Jewish families from their homes because they said that they would give Gaza over to the Palestinians.
August 15, 2005, one of the most dramatic events in recent Israeli history, which nearly tore the nation apart. An Israeli government plan called the disengagement is set in motion, a unilateral pulling out of the Gaza Strip. Some 9,000 Israeli citizens pulled from their homes across 21 settlements in Gaza and 4 northern West Bank settlements to be relocated within the Green Line, in a plan masterminded by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. The decision to leave after 38 years of occupation, sold by leadership to its people as a bid to bolster security for Israelis and lessen the tensions between them and the Palestinians.
But anyway, I just think that's a really cheap comparison, and there is no way that the settlers I just do not see these settlers and Hamas as anything at all similar. In fact, when I look back on the removal of the settlers from the Gaza Strip, it's kind of blatantly clear what the injustice was. For all the talk about, should the settlers be there or not, as it turns out, I would say the settlers had far more right to be there than Hamas did. And so why couldn't the IDF have removed Hamas from the strip? Why did it have to be the settlers? So anyway, let's carry on with this.
I'm going to break in so that we can take time for our break. When we come back, we're going to go further into our question, can Israel make peace with Hamas? And if you're enjoying this debate, I want to let you know you can listen to hundreds more at opentodebate.org. Recent topics that we've taken on include things like, should Trump's convictions stand? Is Islam anti-Semitic? And is it okay to pay for sex? Many, many more. Please take a listen. I'm John Donvan. This is Open to Debate, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. We've got over 300 additional debates that you can dig into by going to our website, opentodebate.org. You can look at our special election series and many, many other topics. Today we're taking on the question, can Israel make peace with Hamas? Our debaters are Cenk Uygur, who is host of the news commentary show The Young Turks, and Mosab Hassan Yousef, who is author and son of a co-founder of Hamas turned Israeli informant. In listening to your opening arguments, what I'm hearing you say, Cenk, fundamentally is that, yes, you can make peace with your enemy because making peace with anybody else doesn't make sense, and that it has happened multiple times, including in the example of Israel having made peace with Egypt and additionally with Jordan and with the PLO in the 1990s. And you're saying that there's no reason that that can't happen again. Mosab, you're saying there's very much a reason that can't happen again. You're saying that Hamas is a different kind of organization, that its ideological motivations make it a distinctive kind of challenge for negotiation, unlike the PLO, which was a nationalist organization, that the Islamists are fired by religion and have aspirations that would not be satisfied by any kind of negotiation. And I want to take the question to you, Cenk. The fundamental point that Mosab is making is that Hamas is different, that it's not just that they have these goals of completely destroying Israel, is that they're fired by religion, that those things can't be moved, that it's an ideological, not a nationalist kind of organization. What about that?
Yeah, it's as if we haven't lived in the world. There's been extremist ideologies throughout history, and we've eventually had to negotiate with all of them. And the reason we were at war or conflict, different civilizations and nations, is because they were extremists, and that's who usually sometimes creates conflict. So that's who you have to negotiate with. So I'll give you many examples. Shia and Sunni extremists in Iraq. We wound up negotiating with them at different times in our occupation of Iraq because that's who was bombing us.
It was a bit more complicated in Iraq. Some of the grievances against the American military were, of course, and with the American presence, it was, like the American military and the presence of civilian contractors who would go into Iraq, tooled up with guns, and who were immune from having to adhere to any rules of engagement. It did antagonize the population, and that had to be understood to a degree, that some of the Sunni groups did have grievances against the Americans, and they had grievances against the Shia, and against the Shia had grievances against the Sunni because Al-Qaeda had done its best to stoke up a holy war between a holy civil war between the Sunni and Shia populations of Iraq. They deliberately bombed mosques, bombed Shia worshippers, they beheaded Shia, and it took a degree of kind of American bribery and working with various Sunni groups to reject the Al-Qaeda hardliners. And the aim was, of course, to try and de-escalate the Sunni-Shia tension as well. Because that just served Al-Qaeda's interest, and America had to kind of be involved in de-escalating it. And it just about worked.
For the third month, Americans have lost more than 100 soldiers.
Deadliest month this year for U.S. troops in Iraq.
As the news from the battlefield got worse, Petraeus upped the ante.
That number has just gone up and up and up.
He decided to try to drive a wedge between the foreign Al-Qaeda fighters and the Sunni tribes that had been supporting them.
They'd gotten tired of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had been abusive. It had been blowing Sunni Arabs up and Sunni mosques up, in addition to Shia Arabs and mosques. And so they were keen to get these individuals out of their areas.
Petraeus made a bold move.
The biggest change Petraeus makes, and the biggest gamble he takes, is he puts the Sunni insurgency on the American payroll.
In one clandestine meeting after another, millions were handed over to former Sunni insurgents.
Giving him 10,905,000.
Petraeus called his Sunni paramilitary group the Sons of Iraq.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 7,000. 10,
20, 30, 40,000.
In exchange for fighting al-Qaeda, Petraeus also promised the Sunnis a role in the Iraqi government.
9, 5,000.
But inside Petraeus's war council, it was not a popular move.
Our own commanders had concerns about this. I had commanders come to me and say, hey, sir, we can't sit down across the table with these guys. They've got our blood on their hands. And I'd say, yes, indeed they do. But that's how these kinds of fights typically end. You have the reconcilables. We want to get as many as possible of them, again, to be part of the solution instead of a continuing part of the problem. And then that will identify the irreconcilables.
Petraeus says he initiated the payoffs on his own authority.
I remember I asked Petraeus once, how did you get President Bush to approve that? And he said, oh, I didn't need his approval, so I didn't ask for it.
In the end, 103,000 Sunnis joined Petraeus's army. They cost $400 million. On the streets of Iraq, they started to rebuild.
We saw a dramatic reduction in violence, and ultimately, over the course of the surge, the level of violence was down by some 90% or so.
By the end of 2008, clearly the Al-Qaeda and Sunni insurgency had been relatively stabilized, and in the Al-Qaeda's mind, they were defeated. They actually said that in many of their transmissions that we were able to pick up.
For a time, I mean, the problem was, of course, then the Maliki government came in, which was very kind of Shia and very paranoid about the Sunnis, and so that stoked the tensions again, and it was a contributing factor in where Al-Qaeda began to infiltrate the Sunni movement again and gain sympathy and began to enjoy a free reign once the Americans pulled out of Iraq.
And so if you want to talk about extremist ideology, imagine if Hamas thought, hey, you know what? Not only should we capture the Jews, but we should keep them. And every once in a while, if they don't obey us, we should rip their skin off them. And maybe we should hang them by a noose and then burn them and sell their babies and rape their women, all their women. You know who believed in that ideology? The slave owners in the South, the Confederacy here in America believed in that. And that was so extreme that if somebody was doing it now, you would say, you can't possibly negotiate with those people. Those are the worst people on earth.
Okay, if you go back further and further into history, you do find, barbaric practices were just commonplace under certain regimes, but still, negotiations were kind of about protecting mutual protections against particular fiefdoms. We didn't really exist in an age of the concept of human rights or anything like that. For a lot of this period of medievalism, it was understood that each society had its vicious pecking order, and that's just how that society operated. And yet it was still kind of possible to meet with leaders and discuss trade deals and this kind of that, and gloss over these horrors. It was just glossed over. It's horrible, it's wrong, but it's just the way it was back then. But even the example he cites of the Confederate States, that America did have to go to war with the Confederate States. There was that's what the American Civil War was about. That there wasn't a peace option there. The option there was you had to go to war. A war that ended up killing how many? The death toll was, I'm pretty sure it was higher, far higher than even what we're seeing in Gaza. The Civil War was really brutal, but it served a purpose to force the South to abolish its barbaric practices and bring America under the big tent. I mean, I remember in one of the Ayn Rand Centre UK debates, they were talking about do Palestinians really deserve a state if the state is only going to become an endangerment to a threat to Israel. And they cited the example of the Confederates, the Confederate South, and said, do they deserve their state? They believed in their sovereignty. They believed that their sovereignty, their right to kind of their practices was taken away. And they said, well, too bad. Your self-determination was to keep this barbaric practice of slavery going, and too bad you don't have the self-determination to enforce that way of life anymore. You know, too bad that, you know, the North forced its more enlightened ways on you. Too bad. Too bad. You know, just because you think you have the right to self-determination doesn't mean you do. You know. Yeah, you don't get your state, you get the enlightened state. And you are told that you know, your way of life is not tolerable anymore. Because it wasn't.
If somebody want to cancel my right to exist, I will never sit down on the table with them and give them any form of recognition. There is no dialogue with someone who wants me to cease to exist. End of the story. Hamas wants the destruction of Israel. They don't want the land. They don't care for the land. It's basically like someone entering the negotiating room and saying, let's negotiate. But after this, I'm going to shoot you in the head. So what's the point of the negotiations? If tomorrow you're going to kill my children, if the day after you're going to attempt to annihilate me, so then what's the point? Israel tried many times to extend their hand. For example, my father was one of those people in the prisons and outside the prisons, abroad, to find a common ground with Hamas. But Hamas totally rejected the existence of the State of Israel. The best they could offer to the negotiating table, a truce that is limited to 10 years. This is what they offered Israel, that we give you a truce for 10 or 15 years, but after that, we don't know what we will do. What kind of negotiations is this? What type of dialogue is this?
I get the sense that Mosab has seen the October the 7th footage. Moreover, he very possibly has seen, or heard rather, one of the phone recordings from the Hamas terror attack, where the most horrific moment when one of the Hamas fighters phoned home, and using one of his victims' phone, he murdered an Israeli woman, and he took her phone, and he was on he phoned his parents and said, I'm calling you from a Jewish woman's phone. I killed her husband, I've killed 10 Jews. And he was saying, you know, be proud of me, your son has killed 10 Jews, and they're all kind of really proud on him and shouting Allah Akbar. And that's a kind of really stark example of, you cannot negotiate with people like that. People that psychotic, you can't negotiate with them. You just can't. These are evil savages. Evil indoctrinated savages. It's beyond our comprehension, really. I suspect it's beyond Chenk's comprehension. You know, do you really think you could bring someone like that to the negotiating table? No. That's someone you keep in a cage at the best, and at worst you put them down like a rabid dog.
Okay, so first of all, the right to exist, I find this to be the most ironic point that the Israeli side makes. So they say, we are not allowing Palestine to exist. We've occupied them for 57 years, and now Netanyahu's government says, I will never allow them to exist, and then turns around in the next sentence says, can you believe they don't want us to exist? I mean, that's patently absurd. You do exist. There's nothing they could do about your existence. You're backed by the largest military in the history of humanity. But meanwhile, you are literally preventing the state of Palestine from existing. And then you say that is such an evil concept that you cannot even negotiate with it. But that's the concept that you not only believe in, but you're in the middle of doing right now. And nevertheless, I would negotiate with Israel.
Again, it's just a pitiful attempt to try and draw some comparison between, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu being intransigent about a state and Hamas showing its murderous intention in one day to murder as many Jews as they can. The two don't even compare at all. It's ridiculous. And also, as I kind of covered in that book, the book on Israel and Palestine, Israel has made generous offers. To a degree, a prompting from America, from Bill Clinton, urging Israel to give up more and more. But it has given up. Well, it endeavoured to give up more and more land. If Yasser Arafat had agreed to the peace negotiation, or Mahmoud Abbas had, and but the Palestinians never agreed to it. The Palestinian leadership never agreed to it. So it's Israel extended the olive branch of will allow a Palestinian state, and the Palestinian leadership doesn't want one. They just want to kind of preserve the status quo of eliciting sympathy from the world and keeping the cause of jihad against the Jewish state going.
And nevertheless, I would negotiate with Israel. Even though they have prevented the Palestinian state from existing, even though they have oppressed and occupied, and then this whole idea of, oh my God, these people are uniquely anti-Semitic.
I'm going to go to Douglas Murray here, who says it perfectly. And he said this to Cenk in other debates, and yet Cenk refuses to even entertain the point that Murray makes.
It is nonsense that the Israelis have prevented a Palestinian state. They gave the Gazans a Palestinian state in 2005. They gave them a Palestinian state in 2005 when every Jewish person was ripped from their homes in the Gaza by IDF soldiers. And the Palestinian people were given a state. And what did they do? They voted in Hamas, who then killed their fellow Palestinians, never had another election, and used all the billions of dollars of taxpayer funds from the US, UK, and Europe to build terror tunnels and to enrich themselves so they could live the life of luxury in Qatar. Again and again, the reason there is not a Palestinian state is because the Palestinian leadership doesn't want one.
Okay, Douglas,
didn't want one in 1947, it preferred war, and it doesn't want one now.
What did you think was going to happen? I hate that they're anti-Semitic, but if you occupy someone for 57 years, did you think they were going to love you? And then go, oh yes, after 57 years of brutal occupation and humiliation and endless slaughters, I expected them to love the Jews. And if they don't, then I'm never going to speak to them. I'm never going to allow them to have a state. But my God, my feelings are hurt because the other side also doesn't want me to exist. It's patently absurd. The only reason you would say crazy things like that is if you never wanted a peace deal in the first place.
Well, so you're building your argument on the false narrative of occupation.
Okay, two things there. Like I said, to a degree, things have to be forgiven in a peace negotiation. I don't think it's easy for it's like after I watched Tantora, the documentary on the Tantora massacre during the Nakba in 1948, I did come away thinking, if I was Palestinian, I don't know how I would forgive that. I don't know how I would ever get to a point where I could forgive that. In the same way that I think, today in Israel, I can't imagine ever forgive, if I was Israeli, I can't imagine ever forgiving October the 7th. And peace negotiations are about, to a degree, they are about forgiveness. They're about accepting that if every nation in the world held onto its grudges, we would never know peace. We would never know peace deals. But the way Cenk is trying to kind of paint this idea of, Israel is unreasonable to think that the Palestinians will never make peace with us, after what they suffered on October the 7th, just feels incredibly tacky and crass. It's like you're kind of painting the Israelis as hysterical and unreasonable after what they suffered. I think that is incredibly tacky in my view. It just is. It's tacky and crass, frankly, at best. I'm not impressed, and I can't imagine many Israelis would be impressed either. Then I suppose it's not me he has to impress, is it? So anyway, let's carry on.
Okay.
So this whole a story of occupation and the victim mentality and why they are entitled for revenge and inflicting pain on Israel and destruction on a peaceful communities because they have been occupied. But then we say, did Palestine ever exist? No, it didn't. It was not a country. It's not a people. It's not an ethnic group. It's not a race. It was just a colonial entity created by the British. Then it was terminated in 1948 when the Jews had the right to declare their independence. They did, but the Arabs refused.
Okay. Now, if you read Mosab Hassan's book, obviously he acknowledges there was an occupation. There is an occupation in the West Bank. He describes the occupation, he describes the IDF, he describes the checkpoints and the riots and the brutality and the guns. His book does not deny that there is an occupation, but I think the point he's getting at here is the occupation is framed as an occupation of the Palestinians, of Palestine. It's framed as an occupation of Palestine, but it wasn't really an occupation of Palestine. What's forgotten is that there was a period after 1948 when, during the Israeli War for Independence, when Jordan and Lebanon, actually, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon and Iraq and Syria moved in to try and prevent the Jewish state from forming and go for a land grab, essentially. It was a land grab, basically, war, and Jordan actually managed to claim the West Bank. The West Bank became occupied by Jordan. I mean, the reason it's called the West Bank is because it's west of Jordan. It's not west of Israel, it's east of Israel. So what he's saying is that it's kind of a misnomer to describe it as an occupation of Palestinian territories, when in fact it's Israel claiming back territory that was claimed by Jordan. It's actually claiming Jordanian territory in war, and so to a degree it is that question, well, why is it that there was no Palestinian movement to liberate the Palestinian territories from Jordanian occupation or Egyptian occupation, back when Jordan occupied the West Bank, Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip, and so basically what he's saying is that it's being framed as though Israel is occupying Palestinian territory. That it's basically just there's just being a vindictive dictator punishing the Palestinians yet again, but it's actually occupying land that belonged to Jordan, that was claimed by Jordan in the power grab. It's basically, so the West Bank was kind of Jordanian territory. It became Jordanian territory after the 1948 war. And Israel claimed it back during the 1967 war, when Egypt and Jordan tried again to attack Israel. And this time Israel gained the territory back, to gain the territory, and so they claimed it by war. And so what he's saying is the idea that it's specifically an occupation of Palestine is the dubious part. It's an occupation, but then occupation often follows war. Often, if you claim an enemy territory in war, then you occupy it on the understanding that that your role is to prevent basically you've got to control this territory that belongs to a belligerent, but that once belonged to a belligerent enemy. You can hold the land as collateral. You can hold the land because it's got territorial value in terms of preventing further aggression if Jordan moves in to attack you again. Or you can rehabilitate the territory you have and rehabilitate it to kind of integrate it into your country and culture. your state and culture. But Israel has not managed to do that. It's like I said, we occupied Germany after World War II to rehabilitate them as a government. To ensure regime change, to prevent another war from kicking off after we ended the occupation. So that's what it's getting at: is who is being occupied. Do you really, because so many people think of it as an occupation of Palestine, when it's probably better framed as an occupation of Jordanian territory, because that's what it really is. And you're saying that the Gaza Strip was Egyptian territory, and as it happens, in 2005, Israel relinquished the Gaza Strip, not to Egypt, but to allow Gaza Strip a certain autonomy. And he's also saying, before then, was Palestine ever sovereign? Well, it was offered sovereignty in 1947. It was offered a kind of a limited, kind of partitioned sovereignty of, a certain kind of division of the Palestinian Mandate territory. And the point is always made that, that if the Palestinians weren't happy with that, well, they'd be people think, well, maybe they'd be happy with it today because they've only lost more and more territory since. If they claimed the territory then, they would have had their sovereignty there and then. But they went to war and lost, and as a result, they forfeit their sovereignty. So he's saying, well, if they never had sovereignty because they chose to forfeit it, then why should they deserve the sovereignty now? They need to claim their sovereignty somehow, rather than just saying, well, we lost the war and you should feel bad for us.
There weren't Palestinians at that time. The Palestinians were Jews, Arabs, Druze, Christians, everybody who lived in that territory during the colonial era. All of them were called Palestinians.
I mean, the truth is that while I don't entirely buy the case he's making, I mean, if you look up at the village of Tantora, for instance, or Deir Yassin, these are old villages, and the Arabs have inhabited for centuries. But Palestine did become a kind of port city. They did attract immigrants, including Jews, but also attracted various other settlers. But it was generally understood that this was kind of, it was part of the umbrella of the Ottoman Empire rather than a territory in itself. It was drawn up a mandated territory, but as I said, it was partly because of the Jewish settlers there that they improved the conditions of life in Palestine and turned it into quite a thriving place of commerce and economy. So it turned into a desirable location for some, but it was resented by the locals, who despised the amount of rapid change that happened and the rapid modernization that happened. Now, in The Darkness on the Left, I showed clips from Tantora, and as you'll notice in that, most of the soldiers interviewed who were part of the Alexandroni Brigade, which was the Israeli army. When they talk about the population of Tantora, they refer to them as Arabs, not as Palestinians, as Arabs. And, I did find that odd at the time watching it, and certainly I almost thought, well, look, are they just using the term Arab pejoratively, in a racist way? And that probably was a misread on my part. It was just that back then that's what they were called. They were Arabs. They were Arab Palestinians, and the Jews in Palestine were Jewish Palestinians.
It's created by the British. It was not a country. It was not like an ethnic country, an Arab country that was called Palestine. So if this is the truth of the situation, then there is no such thing as occupation. Yeah. And the entire tale that you are building on the occupation allegation is false.
So
Yeah.
we're not strictly debating whether the occupation exists or is real as defined by most of the world, but I do think that the point requires a comeback.
Yeah. So thank you for proving my point. So you said, well, we can't negotiate with Hamas. They don't even recognize our right to exist. And then you turn around and said the Palestinians don't exist anyway. Palestine doesn't exist.
I said Palestine
the occupation
as a country
doesn't exist. Nothing exists. Who cares? They're
Arabs
dirt.
exist.
Okay. So you, and by the way, you're wrong. You said that I think that the Hamas is allowed to inflict pain. I never said that. I've never said that. I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's the right strategy. I think the right strategy is diplomacy, civil disobedience, going to the United Nations just like Israel did. Right. But this idea that there is no occupation, it makes you guys sound like you live in an alternate reality. The rest of the planet realizes there's an brutal, horrible occupation of 5.5 million people. It's happened for 57 years. I don't know what version of the multiverse you guys live in where you think that's not an occupation. Are they having a picnic? Do they look like they're happy? What do we do with those 5.5 million people? Do we make them citizens of Israel? Okay, no problem. I don't like that idea because I think it would wipe away the Jewish state. I don't want that for Israel. I want it to be a safe haven for Jews. But you either make them part of the state, or you give them their own state, or you say, no, you're my prisoners, you're my hostages for the rest of time, and I'm just going to make sure you never have any democracy. I could bomb you anytime I want. I could cut off your water, power, electricity. I can make sure your children starve to death, but it's not an occupation. Do you have any idea how absurd that sounds?
Like I said, the reason for an occupation generally, a post-war occupation, is to ensure that the former enemy state or the former enemy, or the former enemy state can be rehabilitated into a non-belligerent. The thing is, he says, give them their own state. Well, that's exactly what Israel did in 2005. It gave the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority and said, we are going to grant you independence now, to build your own Palestinian state. We know what happened. Hamas got elected into power and turned the state into the jihadi hellhole it is. So Israel has done the honourable thing. It's done what Cheng suggested in giving them a state, a small state. So you're saying, well, look, that's what Israel tried to do, and it backfired miserably. If they hadn't done that, then it's very unlikely that October the 7th would have happened. The hope was that it would lead to peace, and it didn't at all. As for the whole thing, the being able to cut off water and power, well, Israel shouldn't have to cut off the water and power. Now, okay, there's certain controversies in the West Bank where there are claims made that the settlers hog the water supply and the better water supply. That is a complaint that's often made, and that should not be happening. There should be there is a legal fight against that, it seems. But the being able to cut off the water and power to Gaza, well, Israel has only ever had to do that when Gaza decides to make unprovoked attacks on Israel, like October the 7th. Israel shouldn't have to do that. And normally it wouldn't. Normally it wouldn't be cutting the water and power to Gaza if October the 7th hadn't happened. So I think it's being kind of moronic to say, and if October the 7th does happen, then why should Israel be providing supplies to the enemy? Really?
Well, I think your narrative is absurd because you choose to be in denial. I just told you that there was no country of Palestine. Excuse me, this is very important.
All right.
I admit that there are Arabs as ethnic group in that land, and Israel has no problem of negotiating and giving them independence. But the problem, every time they were offered a state, in 1948, in 1993, in 2000, they refused. There was no occupation in Gaza. There is no occupation in the West Bank. This occupation...
Mosab, let me ask you, to get us back on point, how does this point strengthen your argument that Israel cannot negotiate with Hamas?
false narrative, and this is, by the way, just a war of narratives, will lead eventually to violence. And when people believe that they are Palestinians, and we ask them why are you a Palestinian? What makes you a Palestinian? But they don't know how to answer that. It's just a syndrome. It's a mental disease. It's a mental illness.
Can you imagine if I said being Jewish is a mental disease? I mean, that's so offensive.
Jewish
what are
is
you?
an
You're born a
ethnic.
Palestinian.
Okay,
what are you?
Okay, Jewish is an ethnic group. It's a religion. It's a culture. It's a nation. Palestine and Palestinian is an ideology. It was born just yesterday. Judaism was born 5,000 years ago. It's the most ancient nation on the planet.
I think what Mosab is saying here is that, well, that he was clearly disillusioned in the Arafat's kind of movement to establish a Palestinian state, and it kind of made him wonder if he was prepared to give up, the offer of a Palestinian state, then was it really a Palestinian state he was after?
Look, I don't agree. I killed myself to give the Palestinians a state. I had a deal they turned down that would have given them all of Gaza, all of Gaza, between 96 and 97% of the West Bank, compensating land in Israel, you name it. Then, when Mr. Fayyad was the prime minister of the Palestinians on the West Bank, we had all the Muslim countries willing to normalize relations with Israel if they had recognized the Palestinian state. Did I agree with the Israeli policy? No. My whole life I did that.
What was his end game really? Was it just money and fame? And are they really a dispossessed people shared by a common ideology, or are they just rival tribal factions who would fight each other to the death if they didn't have a mutual hatred of Israel? That's what he's kind of been left wondering. It's like, what is it that unifies us around the idea of a sovereign statehood? And now there are counterpoints to be made by that. I mean, Lian Mohammed has said that the Nakba uprooted the whole of Palestinian society, and that
the Nakba is my family's story, the story of when my grandparents were forced and driven out of their homes in Haifa, in Palestine, by Zionist militias, and ended up being refugees in Lebanon. The Nakba is our open wound that did not heal, that is still bleeding. There isn't one Palestinian alive today who hasn't been affected by the Nakba that shattered a whole society in 1948.
In a way that did lend me to think, well, maybe that is exactly the power vacuum. It created the kind of, the chaos that led to a power vacuum that became filled by vainglorious narcissists and fame seekers like Yasser Arafat and the nihilists of Hamas. But now, this isn't really in Mosab's book. I mean, this is something that Mosab has kind of come to the conclusion of later, when he's found himself really wondering, well, what is it all about? And I think it's possibly he's talking more from disillusionment than anything, disillusionment in the cause, and wondering, well, what was it really about? And this is kind of the new certainty is formed, and it's a certainty certainly that a lot of Israelis share.
What are you talking about? What is Palestine? What is Palestinian?
What are you?
I am an Arab. I was born in Judea, an Arab. This is my ethnicity. This is my language. Okay, Palestinian. This is something made up by Yasser Arafat, an Egyptian con artist.
Where do you want your brother to go? Where do you want 5.5 million people to go? Do you want them just to stay as prisoners? Do you want them to be ethnically cleansed into a different country? What do you want to happen to them?
Of course, we don't want this. Israel has 2 million Arabs, and Israel did not have.
What do you want them to do with the 5.5 million Palestinians?
As long as they carry this violent ideology, we're going nowhere. I would like for the Arabians to remember who they are and drop this Palestinian ideology, so they are able to see things for what they are.
And be Palestinian, you call it Arab, you can call it anything you like. But the bottom line is, there's 5.5 million human beings there that believe that it's not that they believe, they do not control their own sovereignty. They don't have independence. They can't control their borders. They think they are occupied by their enemies, which is empirical fact. What do you want to do with them if you don't want to do peace?
You need to ask what they need to do in order to achieve.
Oh, we have to. So they have to please their occupiers.
No.
Okay, let me please you oppressors of mine.
No.
I would love to. I'm begging you. I will pass all of your tests.
Jen,
they need to drop violence.
One moment.
This is what they need to do.
One moment, because we're going a little bit both off point and in circles at the same time. But if Mosab is making the point that Hamas would have to do something, that goes back to negotiating with your enemy. Mm-hmm. That there would be an expectation on Israel's part that Hamas would concede something, and vice versa. Is that not going directly to your argument that that's the way things have to go if it's not going to just be all-out war?
So first of all, this idea of preconditions, I don't agree with to begin with, but Israel's not even saying that. Mm-hmm. Israel's not saying, hey, here's precondition 1 and 2. They're saying, Netanyahu at this point is saying, I will never give the Palestinians a state. So he is not a partner for peace. If I believe the same thing Mosab did, I would say never negotiate with Israel, just go straight to war and violence, because they say they're never going to allow you to exist as a state. But I don't believe that. So, for example, I'm a progressive. I can't stand Donald Trump. But when Donald Trump went and talked with Kim Jong-un with no preconditions, I agreed. I said that is the correct thing to do. Now, that's a communist dictator who has concentration camps, the most oppressive nation on earth, even beating Bashar al-Assad and Benjamin Netanyahu. Nevertheless, I agree that you do negotiations with no preconditions, because that's what you do with your enemies. And that's always the situation you're in. I don't have to negotiate with Finland because they're not my enemy.
The other thing you can do with your enemies is utterly destroy them.
That's right.
World War II ended with the enemy utterly destroyed. Is that the only outcome here in terms of Hamas? Mosab, does Israel have to destroy Hamas?
No, not just Hamas, all the Palestinians.
Well, no, my question right now is Hamas. And there is a distinction.
The what so-called Palestinian people, as long as they adapt violence as a way to achieve their political agendas, they are going to suffer. They are going to make others suffer.
You're talking about Hamas.
And I'm talking about not only Hamas, I'm talking about Islamic Jihad, Public Front, and 10 other gang movements that have been adapting violence against the Jewish people only for being Jewish. And as long as we have this violent Palestinian ideology, that includes Hamas, the Islamists, and the communists, the war will continue. The moment Palestinians drop violence as a mean to achieve their goals, then I think coexistence is possible.
My question was, if they don't, is the only alternative for Israel to attempt to destroy Hamas, and can it?
Well, they already did that.
Stated.
This is where we're at right now. This is where we're at right now, and this is why Gaza been turned into rubble. And there is no way around destroying Hamas. And I think if there is going to be any other radical extremist Palestinian movement that will continue to adapt violence and pose a threat to the existence of the State of Israel, then they will be eliminated as well.
Same question to you. Can Hamas be destroyed? Is that an achievable, worthy goal?
Yeah. So first of all, Mosab just said that as long as they continue to do violence, there's such an anathema to the idea of peace that we shouldn't even talk to them. Again, by that logic, no one should ever talk to Israel. Israel's dropped 2,000-pound bombs over and over. They've dropped over 100,000 bombs in an area the size of Las Vegas. They have been way more violent than Hamas. If that hurts your feelings, I'm sorry, but those are clear facts, not even close. They are 10,000 times more violent than any Palestinian resistance, because, and I'm not saying that the Hamas wouldn't be just as violent, if not more violent. They just don't have the capacity for it. Israel does, and they execute that violence all the time. If we eliminate people based on that, you would literally never have any peace negotiations ever. And then the idea of Hamas has to be completely eradicated. That is a purposely unachievable objective. Who comes out and says, okay, Hamas is now officially done?
Before Hamas took power of the Gaza Strip, when the Palestinian Authority was still in charge, and when Hamas were active in the West Bank as well, like I said, Israel very nearly decapitated their leadership in the early 90s when they did. Like, it's in Mosab Hassan Yousef's book. You might remember that in my video with the doctors on the left, I showed a a clip from the documentary Hypernormalization, which looked at the beginnings of Hamas's suicide bombing strategy. How Hamas developed the idea of suicide bombing. They basically inherited it. They were taught it from Hezbollah.
In December 1992, the militant group Hamas kidnapped an Israeli border guard and stabbed him to death. The Israeli response was overwhelming. They arrested 415 members of Hamas, put them on buses, and took them to the top of a bleak mountain in southern Lebanon. They left them there and refused to allow any humanitarian aid through. But the Israelis had dumped the Hamas militants in an area controlled by Hezbollah. They spent 6 months there, and during that time they learnt from Hezbollah how powerful suicide bombing could be. Hezbollah told them how they had used it to force the Israelis out of Beirut and back to the border. The first sign that the idea had spread to Hamas was when a group of the deportees marched in protest towards the Israeli border, dressed as martyrs, as the Israelis shelled them. But it soon became more than just theatre. Hamas began a wave of suicide attacks in Israel.
Just before 9, at the height of Tel Aviv's rush hour, the bomb ripped apart a commuter bus. An amateur cameraman recorded the scene in the moments afterwards as a dazed woman was helped out of the smouldering wreckage.
This was during a period where Hamas had been exiled, and the Israelis had decided to exile the Hamas leadership into an area of southern Lebanon, and basically just left them there without any food, and or international aid. And it was there that Hamas met with Hezbollah, and Hezbollah taught them about how they'd used suicide bombing in their war during the Lebanese war, during the Lebanon civil war. They'd used it to drive out the Americans, and they'd used it to drive out the Israeli forces as well. Now, the funny thing is, one of the deportees, one of the Hamas members who was exiled there, was Mosab's father. Now, the one kind of question you might be wondering then is, okay, so Israel had the Hamas leadership exiled into Lebanon. How the hell did they bring suicide bombing into the Israeli mainland? And the answer is quite simply that humanitarian groups, international humanitarian NGOs got involved. Raised the point about the inhumane treatment of the deportees and argued that they should be allowed food and water and they should be allowed back home, and that it was kind of immoral, it was against international law to keep them there. Which is, yet another case of the international community making things so much fucking worse. Because had, Hamas remained in exile, it's likely that they never would have been able to take control of the Gaza Strip. And it's very unlikely that it's unlikely that the suicide bombings would have happened, and it's unlikely that October the 7th would have happened.
It took us 8 years to capture someone by name Ibrahim Hamid. This mass murderer. 8 years he hid in a small town of Ramallah, less than 20,000 people. It took us 8 years to capture him, while he was sending suicide bombers every other day. It was a big nightmare to capture him. And now what they are doing? Why the hostage situation that we have in Gaza? They want him. He's on the top of the list to be released. Ibrahim Hamid, remember his name? Look him up. They want mass murderers to go back to the street.
So, but the thing is, was it possible then, if there hadn't been kind of a humanitarian intervention, or rather if Israel had not caved to the demands of the humanity of the international community, then would Hamas have kind of met its demise there and then, and we never would have seen, we would never would be here with Hamas, Hamas could have just vanished there and then, really. Yeah, that could have been the demise of Hamas. In a parallel universe, that probably could have been the demise of Hamas, and we would never really know of it again now. But now, point is, at that point, Hamas were powerful. They had the means and resources to do improvised, suicide bombing attacks. Now, the more powerful Hamas got once they took over the Gaza Strip, I think that was kind of the end of their suicide bombing operations. Once they had the rockets and missiles, they were able to kind of build a state army in arms and military. I think they no longer needed suicide bombing, which is odd because it was their modus operandi for such a huge part of the Intifada. But if Hamas were reduced in power, they would probably resort to suicide bombing again. But they would not have the military capacity to pull off on October the 7th again. At this point, it's looking unlikely that they'd ever be able to pull off October the 7th again, given how close to defeat they are. But still, they're putting up a fight. Still, they've still got some supply of rockets. I mean, they've been cut off from their supplies so far. Now, that might not remain the case once Gaza is opened up to commerce again, but we don't know, do we? The point is that the point of the war is not, might not be to end Hamas as an ideology, but to end it as a capable military force, and that's got to be the victory, and also to send a message of the consequences of engaging in Hamas jihad again are going to be harsh and brutal and ruthless and vengeful. I think that message does have to be sent.
There is no such thing. No one could ever say that. And you could see we had America, Egypt, Qatar, Hamas, a huge portion of the Israeli cabinet, even the IDF leaking to the press saying we're all ready for a ceasefire. The only people that held it up were Netanyahu, Smotrich, and Ben-Gvir. And so those people are saying, hey, you know what? I want to continue to do violence, so I'm going to make the standard that you can never, ever match. So how do we know if Hamas is all dead right now? We don't know anything. They keep making up numbers. They say, oh, we had killed 15,000 Hamas members. Then they went down to 9,000.
Let's be clear on something. As I've said again and again, and as Douglas Murray has said it again and again, October the 7th proved that Hamas could never be trusted to honour a ceasefire. And that basically all the ceasefire would lead to is Hamas starting the war again. So I think there's a problem where, change just will not let go of this perception that a ceasefire is a reasonable thing to aspire to. It would be a reasonable thing to aspire to if you were dealing with any enemy other than Hamas. But because you're dealing with an enemy like Hamas, then all a ceasefire means is going back to square one, and all progress in the war so far being lost. I mean, sure, in the short term, a brief ceasefire can lead to, successful negotiations of prisoners, of hostage releases. It has happened, but the ceasefire was always on borrowed time. We know that now. So anyway,
then they went back up to 14,000. So how do we know when they're all dead? And if you're trying to kill all of Hamas, well, you're going to have to kill a lot more than 40,000 Palestinians. Are we willing to do what we did in World War II, use nuclear weapons? Are we willing to firebomb as we did in Dresden and in Tokyo? That makes us monsters. Why would you want Israel to be monsters? Why don't you want them to have a beautiful independent state of Israel and a safe haven for Jews and a beautiful independent state of Palestinians. The idea that the Palestinians are the unique people on earth that cannot get to peace, that they are so violent, they have such a savage ideology they can't get to peace, is both racist and absurd.
So I hear Mosab saying that Israel really doesn't have a choice, and you're saying Israel has a choice.
Of course they have a choice.
Does Israel have a choice?
It's not an idea, it's proven. October the 7th demonstrably proved that that's how violent and savage the Palestinians are. And why it's impossible to trust them with any peace deal. You know, that's just Cenk being thought terminating, you know, and anti-reality, frankly. The point is that, you know, a lot of people did believe, as he did, that surely peace was possible, surely the Palestinians would be interested in peace, and October the 7th came as a shock to a lot of Israelis to realise, no, they're not. And yet, Cenk would say that it's racist to have that, to realise that that's been proven now.
Look, what Hamas did on October 7 was barbaric, was a genocide motivated by sick religion. They attempted to ethnically cleanse a race, a human race. And this is a capital crime that cannot be forgiven.